Welcome to the Podcast Discovery Show, a podcast that is about other podcasts. Each week, we are going to talk about a brand new podcast that we just discovered last week. And at the end of this episode, we're going to find a brand new one to talk about next week. I'm Zach.
And I'm Matt.
And this week, we are talking about a podcast called In Plain Sight, Lady Bird Johnson. And this is a show that is produced by Julia Sweig, who is a New York Times bestselling author, scholar, and entrepreneur. This is from her website. She has been a guest on CBS, CBSN News, I guess, NBC, MSNBC, ABC, CNN, PBS, BBC, NPR, and also the Colbert Report. She has written multiple different books, and this podcast is actually a podcast kind of summary notes or some interesting points that came from her research into a book of the same name. She has a book called Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight, that is all based on the over 120 hours of audio journaling that the First Lady kept while she was in the White House. And the show kind of started out where I heard about this show. This isn't my typical type of show, but I loved the element that it was mostly in her own voice, and you kind of get to hear her thoughts on things. But yeah, the first episode literally starts with the first 14 days after the assassination of JFK and when they were put into office.
Yeah, kind of as they're going through and she's setting up all the Texas stuff, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, okay. And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute. That's right. He got assassinated
Texas.
In Texas.
Yes.
Oh, this is that. Oh.
Yeah. And that's the thing is kind of, there was like an element for me of like, oh God, how close to the assassination is this going to talk about? Because have you ever been to Dallas and seen like, it's like the weirdest theme park in the history of the world.
Really? No.
Literally where he was assassinated in that road, there's an X on the road to this day. There is what I would consider it's like museum guides. If the museum guides did it voluntarily and believed in a different conspiracy theory for each one, they will hand you pamphlets that's literally like, this is what really happened. And they will talk to you about it. It's like this weird kind of like, it feels kitschy, but it's not. You know, it was the assassination of a president, but yeah. It feels weird. It feels really weird when you go there.
Huh.
So no, like as I was listening to this, I was kind of going back in that because like you can really picture like where the motorcade came because there's a literal X on the road where he was shot. And like you can go stand on the grassy knoll. You can look up at the building that Lee Harvey Oswald was in. And like you can do all of this stuff. And it's just the weirdest thing. Okay, first, general thoughts. What did you think about this podcast, Matt?
Well, I briefly told you that I am so uninterested in political content. It's one of my least favorite things. Not because it's not interesting, but because I almost 100% of the time, the people that are speaking or have said stuff or are in power are terrible monsters. Because power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And I don't like when politics or politicians are painted in a rose-colored hue. Because sure. I don't know much about Lyndon Johnson's presidency. But the fact that it's like hiding in plain sight, Lady Bird was a huge part of his stuff. Like, I'm sure he had some pretty monstrous and diabolical policies that he himself enacted and believed in, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm like, great.
I definitely think that when I think that this is not even a hot take. There is no president that has ever been president that hasn't done something that was looked back on kind of like, ugh, this is bad. This is a bad thing that's happened. But for me, the thing that really caught and the premise of the In Plain Sight is that essentially they wanted to explore just how involved she was because there was a lot of that. And then you look at the time period. You look at this is civil rights movement. This is Vietnam. This is a huge, like, there is so many crazy moments in that she has recorded her kind of perspective on as essentially a first person viewer of that. And that's kind of what caught me, because I'm right there with you. I listen to zero political shows. Like if it is about like current politics, don't care, don't want to hear it. Like I just, it doesn't do it for me. I feel like a lot of times podcasts I like because you kind of get that chance to explore an interesting topic or things like that.
Yeah,
and
a little detour on the road of politics.
Learn something new. And that's kind of how I viewed this, is kind of like an interesting moment in history outside of, honestly, I don't really know that much about Lyndon B. Johnson.
Well,
I don't.
I mean, and you described it's during Vietnam, it's during a whole cultural revolution, it's during the civil rights movement, and he was president, and that was a really toxic time. That power was
Sure.
for politics, and I can't help but listening to this and hearing Lady Bird be like, I saw Jackie O, and she had a look that was admirable. She was strong for her husband and strong for her country, and not understand that Lady Bird Johnson was probably a horrible, deplorable racist, a terrible human being who probably believed that the Vietnam War was the only war that's ever mattered.
And I think they get into this. I think and I don't know. I honestly, all I know about her so far is like this episode.
Yeah.
That's all I know. But they do get into, she starts anticipating how like bad the Vietnam War is going to be. And like, she is literally kind of throughout the presidency that because it's a mini series. It's 8 total episodes that is based around kind of her perspectives on things and kind of what she was doing behind the scenes. And then I looked a little bit into some of the stuff she did, and regardless of it, because you could very well be right. No clue. They could all be terrible. No clue.
I mean, usually they are.
But she was historical for a lot of reasons, because before this, the first lady was not really like a thing. She kind of developed the entire world that a first lady lives in now, and so she was the first one to have staff people underneath her. She was the first one to have initiatives like with her name on them. She was the first one to just do a lot of these random things. She was the first one to like go electioneering like and campaigning on her own as like a person, so there's some element of this was also, it was the civil rights era. So it was a time where politics at the time was dominated by men, and she was a woman that started kind of changing that dynamic. And essentially her main thing, and the thing that she ended up doing for the vast majority of this, and they mention it briefly in this episode, is called beautification. And her premise here was, across the US, people feel better if there's less like junk and more nature. And that was the premise. That was basically the entire premise. And so she would essentially go through and just try to plant things everywhere. And a lot of this stuff you can still see in DC today. Like, you can still see the trees that she planted along these places. She would limit billboards and things like that. And she would also really lobby and try to create things that would focus on the national parks of the U.S., which is one of the, I would say, one of our biggest like natural resources, is that we have just crazy beauty in these national parks. And so she was kind of leading the way on that. But it's just so interesting because, like I said, I mostly see this as a cool thing for looking through the lens of somebody's direct perspective who was kind of not the main one. And so, yeah, I am sure there was something about how they acted that I would not like, but it was so interesting to hear literally from her own mouth, kind of her thoughts on everything. And in this first episode, she's talking a lot about, like, she was talking to Jackie Kennedy about, oh, do you want to go change? And then you kind of get that famous line of, no, I want them to see what they did to Jack. And so you have all this like, and then there's like, it almost feels mundane when they're talking about it, but they're literally talking about moving into the White House, like as the new president and first lady. And they're like, oh, it's basically just like switching out houses. It's like, yeah, there was an assassination. There's been like 3 ever in the history. and it's just like kind of glossed over, because I think it's all of this is just so foreign to me in a sense that it becomes fascinating in a way, because it's like they knew that there's no like stopping it. Like, we need to have time to adjust, because it's there's somebody has to be president. Somebody's got to go do the thing. And so you kind of get this really interesting kind of a view of that. But basically she went through and she created a lot of national parks and a lot of just planting flowers basically everywhere. And she ended up kind of leaving that as her legacy, because even at like, I think she has like a library or she has a park, and they still just like, they have flowers and stuff everywhere because of her. And a lot of basically all the first ladies since her have kind of followed in the footsteps of her, and how she goes about trying to create change and trying to do something. Because now every first lady, it seems like, kind of goes and picks a challenge,
they have like one
a goal.
Project. Yeah.
And
that sounded dumb. They have one project to do for 4 years.
But yeah, no, it's just it's a really interesting thing to kind of hear. And I had no idea that anybody did this as part of it. I didn't realize you could listen to kind of like a voice diary of this time, because I don't think it's something that everyone did. I don't think, like, you can obviously watch presidential speeches, but you aren't getting any real like candor out of that. It's not that type of thing where you're kind of explaining it.
Well, and they did also bring up, man, this is just my skepticism and cynicism of it all, that she had gone to school for history, and she was like, why did she do this? Well, maybe she has a soft spot for legacy. And me, I'm like, no, she did it to make it sound like they were good people, not being the main people behind the Vietnam War, like that kind of shit.
Yeah.
It just makes me so mad. It makes me so mad. It's so, like every good thing, I'm like, this is a bad thing, because they're making it seem like it's a good thing.
Okay, and I do understand that. And here is,
I know I can't get over it.
No. It's always been one of my favorite parts of the show. There has been many times where we disagreed. There's been many times where like it doesn't like connect with people like it does others. And I feel like that's fair. But like in the end, the show is very well made.
It's very well made. She did a great job making it sound incredible. Like it's like a Netflix documentary. They really like a kind of one of those standard true crime kind of ones where it's like they have this nice music, they have this nice pacing. She summarizes and paraphrases a lot of this stuff. What's her name again? I'm sorry.
Julia Sweig.
Julia. She sums up stuff pretty nicely, and like a good journalist has those pockets where she'll be like, and then she said, and then she'll actually speak, and she doesn't get too much in the way, but also submits her own thing. So you're not listening to Lady Bird Johnson just speak for 40 minutes with no context.
Yeah, just put it on. Let it play.
She really builds the story well. I got a little lost towards the act. That's not an act. Towards like the second, third-ish of it. Just because there's a lot of like, and then they met here, and then they met here, and then they met here. A lot of those where, and then they'll have a clip of her speaking, and I couldn't remember what they were speaking about, just because it all kind of ran together at that point. But the first episode on a whole for me kind of really had a nice way about it, because I see it as more of like, this episode's the setup.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's true, because it's kind of both of the Johnsons get thrown into the fire because there was an assassination, and they were promoted, and they kind of I don't want to spoil anything, but the next episode, just from the episode description, Lady Bird predicts how the Vietnam War will derail his administration, and proposes a clear end date to his time in office. And then he ends up doing that, and then 3, they kind of have to actually run for president. So they had been promoted to president. And so it's kind of their whole thing. And then essentially the civil rights movement is happening during this because this is the 1964 election. And so, okay, if you want to find out more, I will stop reading kind of what these are about, but it's going to just keep progressing. It's during a crazy time in American history. It is through her voice and through her journaling. And it is fascinating to me to kind of hear directly what she was doing during all of this. And then she's left like an interesting legacy that has been maintained by first ladies ever since. So
she's
really,
also got a great voice. She's very Southern, but it's this dignified Southern that is very lovely. And of course, it has that twang of a old recording. It's very nice.
It really is nice to listen to. I understand. First of all, I do understand your objections to this show, and I just I was not thinking about any of that when I was listening to it.
It's a good show,
to be honest.
For those who like it. Yeah.
No, it's if you are at all interested in kind of history through like kind of a different perspective, it's a really interesting way to kind of check that out through her own voice. It is really cool sounding. But for next week's episode, I do have something that I think that you're going to be into. And this one is called Sound and Vision. This is the podcast from KEXP. And I am a huge fan of basically everything that KEXP does. And
I'm excited because I have ears and I have eyes. So this looks great. This sounds great to me.
This is a fantastic show, and I found two that kind of worked perfectly together, and it ends up being just around 30 minutes, so it's kind of a nice one, too.
Nice.
First one is called How Big Music is Hurting the Industry.
Ooh.
And it's all about how streaming and how we consume music at this point is very different than what we have been doing in the past, and how these things are going to affect the industry, and how they will have to change or adjust for the future.
I will have thoughts on that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure you will. And then we have the second one is called Spotify and Streaming Transparency. So it kind of gets more granular on a specific instance. And it talks about essentially a union advocate and then also a musician, and how the interaction with Spotify plays out on like a very granular level. Like how much do they know about what's happening by streaming on Spotify, which is essentially you must do it at this point, and how is that affecting them? So it's I think a cool one too. But before we head out here, I do want to let everyone know that as you guys know, we have had a pretty long month here. We've had a lot of life stuff happening. I am now clear of COVID, which I did have for the past week. So on top of everything going on in life, we also had some issues with the pandemic that everyone's struggling with. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. Kirk's return is imminent. And we also have big news coming in the next week or so that I can't wait to tell you about. Super excited. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. It has been quite the month, but we're looking forward to bringing out some new stuff and getting back onto normalcy at some level. We're looking forward to it. But yeah,
sounds good.
I guess that's all for this week. And remember,
there's always more to discover. Don't know why I said it like that.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Discovery Show. We would love for you to get in touch. We have a Facebook group called the Podcast Discovery Club, and our Twitter is @thepdsofficial. We also record the show live every Friday night at 8 o'clock on Twitch. We would love for you to be part of the show while we're recording it.
If you want to support the show, we have a number of ways you can do that. From our Patreon to our affiliate links, they're always linked in the show notes. In the end, you support the show just by listening, and it means the world to us. So thank you so much for being a part of our journey.
This was a podcast from the Podfix Network. You can check out more shows like it at podfixnetwork.com.